Hello and welcome to my digital Lightroom workshop. My name is Mike and I'm an Adobe student representative for the University of Toronto. Today we're going to be doing an introduction to Lightroom, how Lightroom can help save photos that you thought maybe have been ruined, or just generally improve your photography, regardless if you're using a DSLR, a pro camera, or even if you're just shooting from your phone. So let's get started. Before we get into the Lightroom itself, I want to let you guys know that by going to tinyurl.com/mdopsa1 will get you the entire Creative Cloud download absolutely free, and you get each program for 1 month. So even if you wanted to download Lightroom this month, Photoshop next month, or After Effects or Premiere Pro or anything in the Creative Cloud suite, you have a full month with each program. So although it might only be for 30 days, you can really extend that out and get a great taste of what Adobe has to offer in Creative Suite. So let's get right into Lightroom. Now, if you're brand new to Lightroom and you've never used it before, it's probably going to look much like this. This is actually the brand new 2015 version, was just released. It's pretty cool. And if you haven't noticed already, there is a download link in the description of this video for the photos that I will be working with in this digital workshop. So there is a JPEG and an RW2 file. So one of those is actually a RAW file. They might be a little bit big, and you can of course use your own images if you'd like and just apply the same concepts. But for the sake of this digital workshop, I do recommend checking these out, and you can work alongside me. So this is Lightroom. Of course, I have nothing in it right now, which if you've never used it before, you won't either. In the different tabs here, you're going to want to make your way to Library, down to the bottom left at Import. You're going to select Dopsa Lightroom, which is the files that I have given you for this workshop, and just simply import those. It should be pretty quick. The files aren't that big, so you should be all right. Make your way to Develop, and you'll notice that they have organized themselves into the bottom bar here. All right, now making our way to the first image, I just wanted to show how Lightroom can help to save photos that are maybe a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark. Now, keep in mind, there are some things that even Lightroom can't save. I know. If it's completely whited out or it's just far too dark, there are ways for Lightroom to help. But in certain extreme cases, photos that are too bright sometimes just simply don't retain enough detail to actually save. But let's take into account an image like this. Now, one thing to keep in mind, this first image here of me that my friend Shyam took in Montreal, it is a raw image. What that means is it's completely uncompressed. It's a very large size image, and if you're using an SLR or a mirrorless camera or even some high-end point-and-shoots, you'll be able to select RAW as an image quality setting in your camera. I highly recommend this to anyone who's really taking their photography seriously, because it gives you so much extra range in Lightroom or in post for Photoshop or anything like that to play with the colors and to really make the image exactly what it is you want. If you're not shooting RAW, or if you're on a cell phone that doesn't support it or something like that, you do still have a little bit of flexibility, and we'll show that later. But if you have the option of shooting RAW, I really highly recommend it. So let's take a look at what we can do with this kind of image here. So if I zoom in just by clicking, you can zoom in anywhere on the image. Let's zoom into this really bright area. And if I hover over the histogram on the right side, this little triangle, all of this in red is showing me what is overexposed or clipping. So that whole area right there that is in red has little or very little or no detail at all. So there's not a whole lot we can do with that part of the image. But although the rest of it may look extremely bright, the camera still retained quite a bit of information that we can now pull back and make the image look as if it was never overexposed in the first place, which is great. So like I said, if we zoom in here, we notice that there's lots and lots of seemingly just white area, and the image, considering how dark it is on the left side and how bright it is on the right side, looks a little unbalanced, looks a little bit off. So first things first, let's take a look at our development tools here in the side. At the top, this is our white balance. This is measured in temperature. If you're familiar with photography and you've been working with white balance before, you'll be right at home here. You can actually just choose to slide the slider all the way to cool side or to the hot side or the warm side. And if you have lost where you were and you don't remember what it originally was, you can actually just double click on it and it'll send it back to where it was originally. Realistically, I think the white balance is pretty good in this image. We could maybe bring it a little bit to the warm side, but ultimately I'm not too concerned with that right now. What I am concerned with is the brightness. Now you might think go right to exposure, because exposure is the overall brightness of the image. But if we bring all of this down, then the other side of the image, because it was dark to begin with, it gets extremely dark. So I'm going to undo that and I'm just going to bring that back to where it was, remember, by double clicking. What's nice about Lightroom is they separate it into highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now they're pretty self-explanatory in those definitions, but the highlights are the brighter parts of the image, the shadows are the darker parts of the image, and then whites and black is complete whiteness or very close to it, and then black is complete darkness or very close to it. What's nice is you can move those around independently. So of course, the whites and the highlights are really what are taking this image to be a little bit too bright. So let's start with the whites first, and let's just bring these down -100. So if we look back at the original, and we can do that with the / button, it'll show us what the image looked like before. In the background, you can see that there's a little bit of a tree here that you notice now that you never noticed before, and that parts of the side of my face are now looking almost similar to the other side in terms of brightness. Going all the way to -100 isn't necessarily the greatest, so maybe we'll bring it back to about -50. And the highlights, remember, these aren't the crazy white areas, but the brighter areas, we can bring those down now. And if we go to, let's say about -90 looks all right. Bring the whites down a little bit further. So if we look back to the original image and to this one, it's much more balanced to what we were seeing before. And it doesn't look nearly as overexposed or anything like that it did before. So the shadows themselves, I think, in the image are fine. If anything, we could probably afford to bring them down a little bit as well. And then you can kind of play with the color. So now that we've balanced it, you can get a little bit more creative with the image. So if you want to add, let's say, a little bit of contrast just for effect. Of course, contrast is going to make the dark parts of the image even darker and the bright parts even brighter in the most extreme areas. So be careful with it. If you bring it too far, you get this really bright and dark polarizing effect, which can be cool. But if that's not what you're going for, it can ruin your image pretty quickly. But again, nothing to worry, just bring it right back down. Or if you go too far on the other side, you get a very flat, balanced image, which, although everything might be even and it'll look even in your histogram, it's not always the most interesting or creative looking image. It's pretty dull. It's by definition, it's quite dull when you bring the contrast down. So I could bring it up a little bit, just under 20, I think it's fine. And I can play around a little bit more with the vibrance. So although we can't save all of the detail, it does retain enough color detail that if we bring the vibrance up, even in the brighter areas, a little bit of color is retained. Saturation, we don't want to play too much because then skin tone starts getting a little odd looking. I look a little bit too orange here. So you can play with saturation a little bit. Let's say maybe Yeah, 20, 25 for each of those is just about right. And if you ever question, does this really look better than it did before? Like I said, you can hit the / key right above your enter button, and you can tell. Very, very bright image. We've saved it. We've brought it back down a little bit. Now it's a much more balanced, much more even looking image. Or if you would like, you can actually press these two Y's here and it'll show you a side-by-side before and after. If you zoom in, it'll zoom in on the same spots as well. So you can really see that there's a lot of detail saved, and for some of those images that we take that are just a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark, of course, you could do the same thing by bringing everything up in the opposite direction. If the image is too dark, we can really save a lot of our images. Now, what I would do from here is I would take this crop marker and I would probably bring in as many of the overexposed parts as possible, just to keep the properly exposed bits of the photo as the focus. You can do even a little bit of a rotate here. And I think that's pretty good as a final image. You know, maybe I could play around a little bit with clarity, which again is similar to contrast, but on a more local level, and I could play with a couple of other color things. But what's important is we've saved quite a bit of detail, and the image is, in my opinion, much more balanced and much better looking now. So yay to Lightroom. It was very, very easy to do that, and I can imagine that you've got a couple photos that you've taken that are a little bit too bright and you wish you could have saved them. Now you can. All right, so that is with a Panasonic GH4. That photo was taken, and it was taken in RAW. That's about an $1,800 camera. It's a $1,000 lens. It's an investment. Those are high quality photography or video cameras that we'd be using for an image like that. So a lot of people think that Lightroom is only good for those kinds of cameras, but that's not the case. So this photo here, believe it or not, the JPEG, the one of the windows and everything we can see here, this was taken on my iPhone. Now, yes, the iPhone does have a pretty remarkable camera for a smartphone, but as an example of what you can do on a smartphone in Lightroom in post, you'll be able to see the difference in just a second here. So what's nice about this image is that there was a lot of light when I took it. So the worst thing about cell phone cameras is sometimes when they have not enough light, everything gets very grainy, everything gets very muddied, and the image suffers overall. But if you have a lot of light, like I did here, of course, the big windows and all the lights indoors were on, it's remarkable how much detail you can actually get out of something as simple as a smartphone camera. It makes me question my photography investment sometimes, but nonetheless, let's see what we can do here and improve this image further. So whether or not I'm sharing it, or if I'm bringing it to social media, or if I'm posting it, or if I'm going to be printing it. You could even print an image right out of your cell phone with a little help of Lightroom. Now, the first thing I like to do with an image, if I don't really know where to start, is I'll start with the very, very brights or the very, very darks, depending on the image. So this photo is more than bright enough. I don't think there's any dark areas that really need to be all that much brighter, which is good. So that means we can start with the highlights, especially in this sort of area here with the trees outside the window. If I go up to see what's overexposed, I'm seeing quite a bit of overexposure. So that's a lot of detail. Mind you, it's not the whole image as it was in the last one, but that's still quite a bit of detail that I'm losing. So let's see what I can bring down in the highlights. You can see the trees in that area specifically gets a little darker, but it kind of matches what the inside of the room looks like quite a bit more. Inversely, I could go up and I could make it completely white if you didn't want to see that. And that's a different effect you can do as well, which looks kind of nice. But for this one, we're talking about saving images today. Let's bring the highlights down. I think that looks good at -75. the whites as well. I mean, you could bring those down a little bit, but it's not going to do all that much. So I think I'm just going to keep those maybe at a conservative -20. When it comes to the color, the images got a lot of nice different colors. So there's the blues over here on the left side, there's the red off of the banner here, but they're all kind of muted right now. I think white balance is fine. If we go without it being a raw image, if you start playing with white balance too much unless you have to, it looks pretty drastic pretty quickly. So it doesn't take long for the image to get very, very blue or very, very orange. And unless that's the effect you're going for with the tint as well, the green and the pink, you know what, I think the magenta actually looks pretty nice at about 2, maybe 15. Yeah, I think that looks kind of nice, especially with the blue and the pink tones here. But regardless, when you play with white balance and it's not a raw image file, you can notice some pretty drastic color shifts relatively quickly, and that might not be what you're going for. Again, all of these rules go out the window if that's exactly the kind of look you want. But for what we're going for here today, I think +16 in the magenta is nice. Great. Now if we go down to vibrance, I can bring up the vibrance basically of the actual colors themselves. So if you go all the way, you start getting a little bit of distortion in the colors, which I don't think is necessary for what we need today. So let's go to about 40. Saturation, again, if you bring saturation all the way down to -100, you're basically working with a black and white image, which looks fine for this photo, but I think because we have all of these great colors, it would be nice to use them. And you notice that when I bring up the saturation, the indoor lights actually become a little bit more orange. Without the saturation, they almost look like they're white lights, but they're actually more orangey lights, which adds a nice little reflection on the bottom here as well. Again, if you want to go back to see what the original looked like, you can do that. I think I went a little crazy on the vibrance there, so I'll bring that down a bit. And then finally, contrast. Because it's a relatively flat image, you can even see in the histogram here, there's a lot in the shadows, a lot in the just under the highlights, but there's not a lot in the extreme areas, so you can afford to bring the contrast out quite a bit to something more like this. And already, if I go back and forth between these two images, or if I do a split screen down the center, you can really tell that the after image is just much more vibrant and alive feeling than the original was. So that's a very simple edit on that photo, and I think I'm much more confident in sending out this picture, be it to Instagram or to Facebook or something like that. If I wanted to show off this photo, I think it looks significantly better than it did just coming right out of the camera, and it didn't take me much time or much effort to do that through Lightroom. Again, I could play around with a couple extra things, like if I wanted to get a really crunchy feel, I could start playing with the clarity of it. Be careful with the shadows with that, but if I bring it to 33, it's really, really crunchy and very, very pronounced for all of the edges and the colors that you can see there. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out, and I like the way it looks. The only thing I'm going to do now is if I go back to crop overlay by pressing R, I can actually bring in maybe a little bit of the bottom here, because there's not a whole lot going on in the bottom there. Gives it a little bit more of a cinematic feel almost. I could pull that back up like that. There, that's a little bit nicer. And then if we scroll all the way to the bottom, if you're using an iPhone or really any camera, a professional camera, but it's really impressive that the iPhone is in here as well. If you go down to Lens Corrections and Enable Profile Corrections, what that will do is it'll add a little bit of anti-distortion to the image, because no matter what anyone would like to tell you, no camera or lens combination is perfect. there's always a little bit of distortion, and some straight lines end up being pretty curved, and that's especially true when you're using wider angle lenses or anything like that. But built into Lightroom, it'll actually automatically correct that for you. It knows what camera I shot this with. It knows that it was an iPhone 6. All I had to do was click Enable Profile Corrections, and as you can tell, it might be a little bit harder to see in the video, but there's just a slight bit of barrel distortion that it's correcting for. And you can go even further with that as well if you wanted to go to distortion and re-correct it. But I like the way that it is automatically at just 100, and you might not notice it right away, but it does improve the vertical lines and everything of your image that way. So today we've corrected an overexposed image, and we've proved that Lightroom is not just for fancy cameras and professional photographers. Anybody with a cell phone can bring their image in here with a little bit of tweaking. You can make it look just that much better before sending it online to print or to your clients. Now, once you're finished with the image inside of Lightroom, you can select each of the images either individually that you'd like to bring out, or you can hit Command A or Control A, which will select all of them. If you want to bring them all out at the same time, go up to File, Export, choose where it is that you would like to save your images. I'm going to go to Desktop. By default, it'll keep the exact same name of the file, so you can actually put it in a subfolder called Lightroom, so you know which ones you have edited and which ones you have not edited with Lightroom. And then after that, export, and in a couple moments you'll be able to share those files ready to go, and you can compare them with the originals. So let's do that right now. Okay, so let's take a peek here. So this is the original file on the left, and this is the Lightroom file on the right. You see we brought up the colors, we brought in the light that we didn't even know that there was detail back here. I say overall that's a great improvement. Now here with the iPhone photo, here's our original, and there is our Lightroom. We take a relatively, I'd say, average, boring, kind of dull looking image, really crunched out the colors and brought in a lot of detail that you might not have expected out of just a simple smartphone. Now, if you have any further questions about some of the modules in Lightroom we didn't get into today, or if you have any questions about Adobe, Creative Cloud, or even some of the things we went over today, please leave me a comment or contact me directly via social media, and I'll be glad to answer any questions we have. Although this was a very introductory workshop to Lightroom, if I hear more interest in photography and more questions about Lightroom specifically, the more detailed we can get in our next workshops, and the more frequently we'll have those as well. So feel free to ask me any more questions, or send me some of the photos that you guys have edited in Lightroom. Thanks, and happy snapping.